Have you ever had another weaver tell you some well-meaning advice, like you shouldn't warp with single-ply yarn, or you should never use knitting yarn for weaving because it just won't work, or my personal favorite, you can't use hand-spun yarn for warp because it's not strong enough? All of these myths have a little bit of truth to them, where certain yarns in these categories might not set you up for success. But instead of telling people to completely avoid entire categories of yarn, I would rather teach you what works and what doesn't work. Why does a yarn work for warp and why doesn't it? Hi, I'm Pamela from Fibersprite.com, and I help fiber artists understand what they need to know so they can get down to their real passion, actually working with fiber. Now, I firmly believe that there is no such thing as bad yarn. There's yarn that you don't like for whatever reason. There's even poorly made yarn, but all yarn can be turned into something really interesting and useful with the right skills. However, there is such a thing as yarn that's not well suited to specific purposes. If there's a mismatch between the qualities of the yarn itself and what you're intending to make with it, sometimes things can go wrong and you'll end up disappointed. This is especially true for warp yarns. They have an extra requirement because they need to be able to hold up to the tension and abrasion that they're going to be subjected to by your loom and the weaving process itself. There are a couple of ways that you can test your yarn to make sure that it's suitable for use as warp. The first is to try and break it, and if it doesn't break, then it's going to be strong. And the second is to subject it to some abrasion and see how it holds up to that abrasion. These tests combined together give you a lot of information about how your yarn is going to perform as warp. The first thing I like to do when I'm checking a yarn for compatibility for warp is to tug on it. If I tug really hard and it doesn't break, that's a good sign. But just tugging in this small area is not quite enough. You also want to space your hands fairly far apart so that you can simulate the distance that the yarn is going to be on the loom. A nice pinging sound when you tug on it, almost like the sound of a guitar string, indicates that the yarn is pretty strong. Another test is to do an abrasion test. So in this instance, we're going to rub against the corner. This is a box, you can use the corner of a table, and you're just going to rub that yarn in that one spot quite a few times. How is it affected? It's probably going to be a little bit fuzzy, but if it stays in good shape, then it's a good candidate for warp yarn. Let's look at a few other yarns. This is a single-ply yarn, and when I tug on it, it does okay. It even makes that pinging noise. But if you notice, there are areas that are thick and thin in this yarn. Some areas are more pronounced than others, and so I do still want to keep doing some more tests on this yarn. If I pull gently, it is starting to stretch on me, and it's a single-ply yarn, so that's an indication that we want to be careful. And I want to especially check some of these areas that are kind of slubby. And look at that, that just drifts apart. It doesn't even make a snapping sound. It just falls apart. And these long tails of unspun area, those are indications that it might not be the greatest candidate for a warp yarn. This is also a single-ply yarn, and it also has some slubby areas, but it was finished with more of an aggressive finish where the outsides have been felted, and it's also been through a post-spinning dye process that was fairly aggressive, so I know that this yarn is probably going to be a little bit stronger. It still makes that nice pinging sound. Even when I pull it apart, even in those slubby areas, it's not falling apart. For yarn like this, which is hand spun and has a lot of slubs in it, I do want to check quite a few areas to make sure that it's consistent across the yarn. I'm going to do the abrasion test with this one as well, just to see. That's held up pretty well. There are a lot of things that affect abrasion. There's the material of your reed, the condition it's in. If it's rusty, it's going to cause more abrasion. How much tension you have on your warp is going to affect your abrasion. How much draw-in you have. The more draw-in, the more abrasion you're going to have, especially at those edges. If you have threading errors that are causing some twists and stretches, that's going to create abrasion as well as extra tension. All of these things are basically settings on your loom or settings with how you're weaving, and they can be adjusted to some degree. Knowing that your yarn is capable of withstanding abrasion while it's in this high stress area is really important. If it's not, you're likely to end up with a fuzzed up warp, and you're likely to have more breakages, especially around the selvages. If you look at your loom, there's an area between the fell line and the reed, and this area is subject to the most abrasion. This is because of the reed's motion, constantly going up and down those yarns. You're going to have more potential for abrasion at the selvages, especially if you have some draw in. I use a clip-on temple to kind of pull that out and reduce that risk of abrasion, but you still do have some abrasion in the center here because it's rubbing up against the reed. It's important to check your reed for rust to make sure that there's no extra abrasion that you don't know about that could be risking breaks in your warp. So at this point, you've done the break test, you've done the abrasion test, and if your yarn passed both of them with flying colors, then you have a great warp yarn. Congratulations. But if your yarn failed one of these tests, that doesn't mean that all hope is lost. There are still a couple of things that you can do to still use that yarn as a warp yarn. The first thing that you want to do is consider the loom you're using. If you have access to more than one loom, then you'll know that each loom does something a little bit different. A really large jack floor loom is going to be heavier and put more tension on your warp than a small rigid heddle loom. I often turn to my Cricut rigid heddle loom as a way to get away with using yarns that I would never use on my big floor loom. There are two reasons for this. First of all, the yarn is not going to be under as much tension on the rigid heddle loom. And second, the area that it weaves between the fell line and the heddle or the beater is much smaller. On my floor loom, I have about this much area that the beater is passing across and abrading every time I beat the warp. And then it advances to 1 or 2 inches, and then we go back to the beginning and we're still abrading this big area. That big area of abrasion means more opportunities for breakage. But on a rigid heddle loom, which is much smaller, I have maybe about this much area. So on a delicate yarn, I can get away with a gentle beat, being really slow and careful, and not having as much area that's going to be abraded as I'm weaving. Another option is to size your yarns. Now, I'm not talking about the thickness of your yarn or the length of your yarn or anything like that. What I'm talking about is sizing. Sizing is a glue or a paste or a starch that acts like a armor for your yarn. It gives it extra strength against abrasion and against that tension that it's under so that it can make it through the warping and weaving process without breaking. Sizing is often used on fibers like linen because even though they're very strong, they're very prone to abrasion. You do have a couple of extra steps with sizing. You have to apply it to the yarn. You have to make sure that it's evenly coated, and you have to let it completely dry before you put it on your loom, and then it needs to be washed out after you're finished weaving. But it can be a really valuable resource for making that weaving process go easier and smoother with a yarn that you might not normally get away with as warp. Remember, if you do ultimately decide that your yarn is not suitable for warp, you can still use it for weft. Some of the yummiest yarns make excellent wefts, even if they don't perform so well in the warp. And if your warp yarns do occasionally break, it's not the end of the world. You can always repair a broken warp end. Our goal with testing yarn for suitability as warp is really to make sure that on the whole, it's going to perform well. You don't want to spend a lot of time and money on yarn and warp it and have it completely shred every time you make a beat, another end breaks. And that is just miserable, and nobody wants to go through that. So do yourself a favor and make sure you're testing your warp yarns for suitability before you put them on the loom. Over the next week or so, I'll be sharing some examples of yarns that I used as warp that tended to break the rules. In most cases, I knew what I was up against, so I was able to adjust the settings on my loom or choose a different loom in order to have a successful outcome. But there's one instance where I really messed up. So be sure and follow along so you don't miss anything. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.